Exodus chapter 21. And we finished off, I believe, on verse 15. So we're going to be picking up on verse 16. The last week, the Lord laid out the law concerning the relationship between the servant and the master. It's what we covered. And then he laid out the law regarding violence. Then he began with the issue of murder and capital punishment and started to deal with that. And there's no need to recap all those laws that we went through last week for, they are there for your reading, and we do record these things. But right now we're continuing on. We left off in verse 15 where he stated, "He who strikes his father or his mother shall surely be put to death." And just to be clear, these laws that usually use the his or him or he refers to both men and women. Okay, so let's continue. Exodus chapter 21, verse 16. "He who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he is found in his hand, shall surely be put to death." So, kidnapping was a capital crime. And I know in California back in the day before I was born, kidnapping was a capital crime, and it's not anymore. Thing is, we as a nation, come from a godly heritage where most nations in the world don't. Their moral fabrics of their laws did not come from the Bible like it has with us. But it would be nothing for a nation who was trying to get themselves established to veer far from the standard of God. But we as a nation, we've had the responsibility from veering away from it. But the degree in which a nation veers away from the standard of God's law is to veer away from the high standard for law and order, for right and wrong, and for godliness and holiness in the culture. And now, as we have seen in our lifetime, many of the laws that used to characterize the standard of God's law have veered from sentences now. We've seen that certain crimes have gone to lighter crimes that used to be capital punishment in the United States, such as kidnapping right here. Verse 17, "And he who curses his father," so now not only we go from the physical abuse or the physical assault from the children to their parents, but now we move into the verbal abuse of parents. "And he who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death." Wow. The Lord was not going to put up with it. He was not going to allow a little leaven to leaven the lump. He would not allow it to corrupt his people, and it was not to happen. So it's, as you can see, God has a standard that the parents are to honor. The kids are to honor their parents, not slander, not abuse them, not physically abuse them or anything like that, but to show and give honor to the family unit, the parents of the family unit, because that's so important into society, as we talked about last week. He says, now God moves on in verse 18 about the laws that govern violent crimes and personal injuries. Verse 18, he says, "If men contend with each other," we're talking about two men getting into a fight, "and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die, but is confined to his bed," meaning he's badly injured from the fight, but now he's confined in the bed. He says, "If he rises again and walks about outside with his staff, then he who struck him shall be acquitted." In other words, there are no charges to be brought against him, but he shall only pay for the loss of his time and shall provide for him to be thoroughly healed. So they both equally entered into this fight. They are both equally, guilty of getting into a fight. They took those matters in their hands, so they're both responsible in that case. However, if this other person walks out from being confined, the one who struck him is acquitted, because again, they both entered the fight. However, he is responsible for time loss at work and is to pay for that time loss and all the medical expenses for his healing until the man is thoroughly healed. Verse 20. "And if a man beats his male or female servants with a rod, so that the servant he dies under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Now, as we can see, the Lord forbids the beating to death of a servant, which it wasn't common in those days to view servants as property. Not even as human beings, but as property. And you can do whatever you wanted, but God says no. That's not how I see the servants and things. So God comes in and he protects life, even if it's a master who comes in and beats a servant to death. He's going to be held accountable for it, responsible for his actions for it. Verse 21, notwithstanding, if he, the servant, remains alive a day or two following the beating, he shall not be punished, for he is his property. So the idea here is that if the owner wanted to beat his servant to death, he would know how to do that. That wouldn't be an issue for him. So if he beat him to a point where the beating wasn't severe enough to kill him, but at a couple of days he lived and succumbed to his injuries to death, then they were to take into consideration that this was not premeditated. The owner did not intend to kill him. That was considered an accidental death. And the punishment was considered the loss of his property as a slave. It's a little rough, but it's pretty clear. Verse 22, if men fight and hurt a woman with child, so she's pregnant, and you have this fight that just kind of breaks out in between two men, and a pregnant woman gets caught in the middle somehow in the crossfire, so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows, meaning both the mama and the baby were not harmed, they're okay. It says, he shall surely be punished accordingly as the woman's husband imposes on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. So she's an innocent bystander here when this fight breaks out. She gets thrown to the ground somehow or knocked over by force or whatever the case may be, and it causes her to go into a premature labor. But then both her and the child are okay. Then the husband of the wife can go to the judges and determine a financial sum that was to be paid to the husband because of what the two men have done. Now, one thing we see that God is developing in his people through these laws is personal responsibility for your actions. That's the big theme that we're seeing. I talked about it last week, that he's going to start, he gave the 10 commandments, but now he's going to go in depth with these things about taking personal responsibility. And basically, when you do what you do and it goes outside of your control and it impacts another person, you can't just say, oops, like, oh, or my bad, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean for that to happen, right? You are responsible for your actions, regardless. And to me, it's a good thing. It causes people to have to think before they do anything. So this is the idea with these two guys who got in a fight, and the lady and the baby ended up safe and sound, but they did bring physical trauma into the family or the birth process, and they were to pay a price for it, to make them think twice before getting into another fight and getting lost in the fight where they didn't care who else was impacted or hurt outside of the one they were trying to hurt. But then look at what he says in verse 23. It's pretty interesting. He says, but if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life. In other words, if that fight breaks out and the baby is lost as a result of it, or if the mother dies as a result of it, then it is a death penalty that was needed to be charged against them. And I think that's pretty fascinating, because here in this passage, God holds the same value of an unborn child as he does to the mother in this incident, whether it is the baby or the mother that is lost. He said a life for a life. And it's the same to God. So God sees the child in the womb as a human being, as a human life. That is the standard, and it is, in my opinion, just wonderful, and I'm sure we all agree. It's a wonderful opinion, that he sees that as life and a human being. And so we should praise him for his standard. because this is a standard that our nation has lost sight of for decades until the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Now, what is interesting about this verse is that this scenario was an accident. But with an abortion, it's the complete opposite of this. God's standard does not change, however. He values life of the child in the womb, and he sees that the child is a human being. And I know this is a sensitive subject, but I'm here to share the truth. Truth is not relative. Truth is absolute. And the truth is, no matter, what the scenario is, the child is a human life. No matter how people try to define it in relative ideas, or whatever the case may be, the life is innocent and does not deserve death. And I know this is a painful subject for those who have chosen to have an abortion in their past, but God has forgiveness as well for those, and he knows how to heal us and comfort us, and he does that. And we all have sin in our past and have experienced his grace. But please understand that as we study through his word, we cannot just pass on these passages and never talk about anything that can hit close to home in the Bible. Or we will never keep holding God's standard of holiness high in our own lives to be an influence in the culture. The child's life, bottom line, was viewed with the same value as the mother, not separate, not as her individual body. And then, verse 24, he says, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Verse 25, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. And this is what we call equal justice. So it was given this way to the wrongdoer that it would not be too lenient, nor would it be too harsh. In case it wasn't like, a celebrity or a person with high stature who was the person who got hurt, because people favored him, they probably would be extremely mad at the person that they hurt, the person that they loved, this favored person. He says, no, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. He would get a just punishment as rightly deserved. He wasn't allow people to get their emotions into someone that they favored the most and say, oh, they did this to him, well, he deserves twice, that kind of thing. God's like, no. We're going to be given just punishment, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that case. Verse 26, if a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys, in other words, the eye goes blind, he shall let him go free for the sake of his eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of his male or female servant, he shall let him go free for the sake of the tooth. Now, how many servants do you think went to their master and say, hey, just pop me one good one right here. Hit me with your best shot. Come on, I started to laugh about that because I'm like, I know I would. I'd be like, dude, just hit me right there. Just knock it out. I'm gone. But the Lord is stepping in for the servants and the slaves, who in those days, they didn't have rights. So God kind of steps in and says, hey, look, these people are not to be abused, whatever position they have in life. Now, again, the idea of these laws from the Lord resulted in people being held personally responsible for their actions. And remember, he is the king, and he's establishing the law for his people. So again, they had to be responsible for their own actions before they do something that they have to now think about, about before they do it. You know what I'm saying? They have to think about the greater picture with their actions, because this may affect other people or other people's property and the consequences for their actions. So, there's certain things that we won't do because we understand the consequences. You don't go speeding down the freeway and breaking a law knowing that there's a ticket that can come your way if you get caught, right? So, but today, we have seen that society has moved far away from a lot of this in this country, especially one with sparing the rod. I've seen a lot of families go further away from discipline their own kids, and so going through the law kind of gives us a refreshed perspective of where, our founding fathers came from and where their thought processes were. But then he moves into verse 28 with gross negligence and says, if an ox gores a man or a woman to death, then the ox shall surely be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall be acquitted. So an ox gets out and he gores a person to death. You find out and probably pretty horrified and in shock because it's never done that before. The ox was then to be killed. No one was to eat it because it has shedded man's blood. But you as the owner were not responsible for it. In other words, you get acquitted from it because it wasn't negligent on your part. You could have not have known that this was going to happen. But, verse 29, but if the ox tended to thrust with its horn in times past, and it has been made known to his owner, and he has not kept it confined so that it has killed a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and look at this, and its owner also shall be put to death. So, he owns this animal and knows that this animal has a history of probably being dangerous, maybe charging at people or, threatening people. So he knows it's a dangerous animal and a threat to people and their safety. And if that ox gored some person and kills them, then the ox is to be killed along with the owner for it because he was negligent and putting people in danger from his animal that he knew could kill somebody. And that was the punishment for that gross negligence. And this is something that, none of us have oxes. Right? But this is something that we probably can relate to by seeing with dogs. And usually we hear about what dog in dog attacks? What was that? Pit bulls, yeah. And we see it in the news where this pit bull gets loose and tragically attacks a child and does a lot of harm to that. And that's what we hear commonly, but this is kind of something that we can equate to the ox, where the person knows the dog's aggressive. We all know that a pit bull can be aggressive, and protective, but we've seen these things many times now. But don't email me if you have a pit bull. Pit bulls are not all like this. I get it. I'm only referring to things that I've heard from the news that I've seen. But here God, he's dealing with an ox or animal. The people who own these animals were to think about other people concerning their property and their decision making. God says to the children of Israel that they have a responsibility to take the safety of their neighbors and others to an account with their actions, to be a good citizen. It's just, to me, I think that's right and just. Then verse 30. If there is imposed on him a sum of money, then he shall pay to redeem his life, whatever is imposed on him. So in this case alone, if the family and the judges of Israel decided, we will fine this person a certain amount of money rather than capital punishment, then God will allow that to be done for here. So it's in this case right now alone. So if they think that, hey, look, he was being negligent and all that, but we're not going to pose. If he can pay this, then he can redeem his life. So that's a case-by-case scenario, I guess. So verse 31, whether it has gored a son or gored a daughter, so you can see the sex didn't matter, according to this judgment it shall be done to him. So that's how they were going to look at it. Verse 32. Now if the ox gores a male or female servant, he shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. So here's the law that is related to the slave or servant that was gored. Apparently 30 shekels of silver was the price of a slave in those days. And what's interesting, does this sound familiar? Yeah. It's interesting that Judas Iscariot betrays Jesus the night before the cross for 30 pieces of silver, the price of a gored to death slave. God now deals with the negligence of an open pit. Now, how many of us have an open pit? I'm just kidding. Verse 33, and if a man opens a pit, or if a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and either, we're talking either an existing pit like a well or something that it's not covered, or he digs one and still does not cover it, making it unsafe for those, walking near it, and an ox or a donkey falls in it, the owner of the pit shall make it good. He shall give money to the owner, their owner of the donkey or what so, but the dead animal shall be his. So again, this is gross negligence, where he opens a pit where anybody can just kind of walk without paying attention and stumble in like an animal, and he's held responsible for it. He keeps the dead animal, but he would have to pay the owner of the value of that animal. Verse 35, if one man ox hurts another so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and divide the money from it, and the dead ox they shall also divide, which is, in my opinion, that's fair, So he says, or if it was known that the ox tended to thrust in time past, and its owner has not kept it confined, he shall surely pay ox for ox, and the dead animal shall be his own. So this, for the protection of other person's property. And to own ox back in that day was a big deal. It's comparable having your own tractor, because the ox, they plow the fields. That was their livelihood. And so it was there was like this property that they had that their life depended on it. So, here God is protecting people's livelihood and property. Again, the whole personal responsibility thing. But then he adds the element of restitution. And this is, as we're looking at the law, this is a problem in our country today. When I started thinking about it, man, with the sheer numbers of criminals that this nation deals with, hearing that the jails are flooded and all that, you come to find out that restitution is not even on the table, not typically in criminal law. In civil law, that is where you may take care of that kind of thing, but not on criminal law. But here in this day, they were forced to pay restitution. It came out of their own pocket when you caused harm or a hardship on someone else. And again, God does this so that you would never do it again. It's the whole idea of being responsible and for your own actions. And you don't want to pay restitution again. So you learn the hard way the first time, and you'll be careful enough not to do it again. So these are good and healthy laws. So let's continue on the next couple of verses in chapter 22. So Exodus chapter 22 is where God now begins to talk about the laws concerning personal property. Come on, guys. You guys loving this? Going through the law in these chapters are, they're pretty exciting. But thank you for showing up so I didn't have to teach alone. I appreciate that. Anyways, verse 1. If a man steals an ox or a sheep, we're talking about theft here of personal property, and he slaughters it or sells it, he shall restore 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. Again, restitution. Make them pay for their crime. And here God has them pay 5 for an ox and 4 for a sheep. And why more oxen than sheep? Yes. Oxen had to do with their livelihood. Being stolen from them, when they take an oxen. It's like everything that they do to survive and live is in that ox. So to take that ox from them, it steals from their livelihood rather than their food source, which a sheep would provide, even though sheep do help out with livelihood, But they would have to pay if they stole that ox. Not only do they have to give him the ox, but they have to give him 5. And with the sheep, if they steal 1 sheep, they have to give him 3 more. So, but if they couldn't pay, if they could not pay that restitution, then it means slavery. It means slavery. For 6 years, they would have to work to replace that times 5 for the oxen and times 4 for the sheep. They had to pay restitution. So pretty solid message if you ask me. Crime doesn't pay, right? Verse 2. If the thief is found breaking in and he is struck so that he dies, there shall be no guilt for his bloodshed. And this is assuming that this is taking place at night. Okay, this is a nighttime. Now, verse 3 says, if the sun has risen on him, there shall be guilt for his bloodshed. So God, he gives an allowance for crime being committed at night, where they try to break into the house, and it's dark and you can't figure out, if you have a thief in or if you have a murderer in your hands, is he in the house? Is he halfway in the house? Whatever the case may be, it's not clear. You're just kind of finding out as you go. You stumble upon him, you see him, and you take things into your own hands and you kill the guy on the spot because you don't, have the ability to know the danger he brings. God says that is self-defense. Okay, but if the sun has risen, and if the same guy is trying to break in, the same window, and you see him, and you're like, wow, man, there's this, drug addict trying to get in, probably trying to steal valuables, where, all you have to do is basically go into the, sneak up to the window and knock on the window. Ah! He'd probably go taking off running, right? So, you can do that. And that's what God said, that's fine. But if you were to take it in your own hands and you strike the guy that's trying to break in, God has a problem with that. In that situation, you're not allowed to kill a person over property. So God steps in with his concern for blood, again, where blood should not be shed unnecessarily. Even for the thief, he's like, I don't want him to be killed for just being a thief unless there was a legitimate physical danger. If someone breaks in during the day and you see the physical danger and they're in their house and they intend to do harm, then it's self-defense. Okay? Now, if he is stealing and you catch him in the day, look what it says, he should make full restitution. If he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft into slavery to be able to pay off the restitution for all that he took. Verse 4. If the theft is certainly found alive in his hands, like if he stole a sheep and he still has it in his hands, whether it's an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he shall restore double. So that's if he caught the man, he's got the animal alive in his hands, whether he's walking the oxen, whether he's walking the donkey. Not only does he have to return that animal back to him, but he has to get him another one. And so that's the restitution that he has to pay. And we're going to go ahead and stop right here as I approach 30 minutes and continue next week, Lord willing. Let us pray. Lord, we thank you for